This week, Paul and I discuss the OWASP Application Security Verification Standard. In the news, Meltdown Spectre-based malware is coming to your desktop. Us millennials are killing passwords with biometrics, and Lenovo shows us why relying on biometrics is a bad idea. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. This episode is brought to you by IT Pro TV, binge-worthy learning for IT teams. Why is it binge-worthy? It's learning presented in an engaging and entertaining talk show format that beats voice-over PowerPoint snooze fests. IT Pro TV offers an on-demand course library with more than 3,300 hours of content. Watch on your desktop, on the go, or in the comfort of your own living room. IT Pro TV is IT training you and your team actually want to watch, which means a better return on your learning investment. Get started with IT Pro TV for Teams with a special offer for Security Weekly listeners. Visit itpro.tv/Security Weekly to start a 7-day free trial and get 30% off a standard or premium IT Pro TV membership using the code SECWeekly30.
Welcome everyone to episode 4, our 5th episode of Application Security Weekly. I am, of course, your host, Keith Hoodlet, and I'm excited to be joined once again by my prescient co-host, Paul Asadorian. Paul, welcome back.
Wow, I'm prescient, huh? I think
This time
I need
around,
to.
yes.
I need to look that up. I hope it's good. Thank you, Keith. It's wonderful to be here on Application Security Weekly. Always excited for Application Security Weekly. It's new. It's fresh. I'm excited. I'm
Awesome.
so excited.
And we have actually...
Oh, go ahead, Keith. Sorry.
No, you're so excited. Go ahead.
I'm so excited to announce our new sponsor. And I am very biased with this particular sponsor because Matt Alderman now works for this sponsor. And Matt and I, at this point, now go way back when we used to work together at Tenable, which is it's kind of weird when Matt's here in the office because I have like all these reminiscent thoughts and moments that we shared at Tenable. Which is good. But Matt now works for a company called Layered Insight, who's the latest sponsor here on Application Security Weekly, and they are the industry's first. So I'm going to just read their ad read and maybe Keith get answer a quick question or two about Layered Insight. The industry's first embedded security approach for containers, trusted by Global 1000 enterprises to secure their containerized applications. It's the only solution that requires no root privileges, has zero dependency on the underlying infrastructure, and is fully portable across any container environment. Unified DevOps and SecOps, enabling the rapid development of containerized applications without worrying about security. To learn more, make sure you check them out at layeredinsight.com/ASW. So I'm, of course, excited to have a container security company as a sponsor here on the show. Our sponsors are really partners, and we very carefully choose our sponsors and vet them. Even though it was Matt, I still made sure that he wasn't full of crap, basically, which, happens sometimes with Matt. But in this case, he's spot on because I was like, yeah, no, dude, I get it. I like it. I like the approach. I like the technology. So, and I think this is going to be a very much emerging space, Keith. I don't know if you have questions, comments.
Yeah, I'm excited just looking at their website to see that not only do they work with Docker, which is my favorite container technology, but of course Kubernetes is on there. They work across platforms for Amazon, Microsoft, Google, OpenStack, Mesosphere. I was just like looking at this and thinking to myself, dear God, is there anything that they don't cover? In terms of a bell curve, I think that at this point they've pretty much got it all under wraps there. So I'm excited to be talking with them at some point as a partner on the show. And I look forward to learning more about their technology as well.
Awesome. All right. What else you got for us, Keith?
Well, I was going to say, Paul, do we have any other announcements this week in terms of on-demand material or anything like that we want to cover?
I can do a couple of quick announcements to the next segment. So,
Sure. Sounds good. So this week, we're actually covering the OWASP Application Security Verification Standard v3, which is kind of cool because as a standard, a lot of people, at least for me, I hadn't really heard about it. Everyone knows about the OWASP Top 10, But I started digging into this after reading some stuff from Jim Manico, and it's actually really nice because what it does or what it is it's a verification standard for application security requirements or tests that can be used by architects, developers, testers, security professionals, and consumers. So, to the extent that it allows for controls that focus and normalize the function or non-functioning or functional controls of applications from a design, development, and testing standpoint was really exciting to me. So I've started reading through some of the verification standard, and to the extent that the OWASP top 10 is great from a watch out for these landmines, the verification standard then takes that and packages it into a way that companies can actually use, right? So rather than say don't do SQL injection, it's like think about the architecture of your application and how and where you do things in your application so that you don't become susceptible to SQL injection. It's kind of a nice twist on it. Paul, what do you think about the main goals? I know that first of all, helping developers is probably the most important part of this. But from having worked at Tenable, especially, like, is it useful to companies and organizations from like a standpoint of helping them figure out what they should secure against? What are your thoughts there?
I get leery of anything that's a standard or a best practice. Just to kind of play devil's advocate for a moment, we touched on this briefly last night on Paul Security Weekly, but I think many organizations and teams are looking for an answer, but they don't necessarily understand the problem. And I think that, you know, standards and best practices seem like they could be something that may help and solve their problems, when in reality those problems are much, much deeper and more expansive than any standard or best practice can follow. And I've always viewed standards and best practices in this light as maybe a good starting point, but I firmly believe you got to do some work up front to define your process, define your problems, define what you want to go look for in your applications in this point, and how you want to do that and how that ties into your process before you go off and start, you know, reading a standard and like, oh, maybe this is a good basis. I feel like people use it too much as a crutch, I guess is my...
Makes sense. Makes sense. And so to some extent, I think that the nice thing about this standard is it prompts the kind of thinking that would lead to those practices coming into play that you can then refer back to the standard to see if you're complying to it. So the other side of this as well is this isn't an actual compliance standard. You don't get certified for this. There's no sort of like, yeah, unlike PCI, for example, there's no sort of, oh, I'm ASVS certified. It's, are you adhering to, or are you at least leveraging the information provided in the standard? But I'm actually very much in agree with you when it comes to the term best practices. In fact, I often refer back to a quote from retired U.S. Army Colonel Gregory Fontenot, who stated, "When you hear best practices, run for your lives. The Titanic was built with best practices. It was faithfully operated in accordance with best practices." And personally, I have kind of taken that quote, and I feel the same way. Best practices, it's like best current practices, best known practices. Like, best practices change, and if they're best practices, that means they are the best and they don't change. So having at least, and especially with this case, I mean, as I said at the top, this is version 3 of the standard, so it's not like it's a standard where, okay, one and done. It's kind of a living document, and it grows and changes over time, and they've added a lot to it. So the nice thing that diving in a little bit into it from the standards perspective is it actually has 3 different levels that it takes into consideration when it comes to application security. And it gives you kind of guidance per each section. So the first level is all software. So all software should adhere to some very, very basic sets of requirements as it relates to architecture or authentication or session management, etc. The second layer is for applications that contain sensitive data. So maybe that's credit card information, maybe that's PHI or PII. And then the third layer is for critical applications that are high value in terms of transactional data, maybe even very specifically medical data, but things that are requiring a high level of trust. So maybe even like government organizations that need to have some sort of like confidence that this information isn't being leaked out. OPM, for example, is a great kind of filler there. The nice thing about this that I like is it takes the idea that not all software is created equal, and therefore not all software should necessarily adhere to the same security practices in accordance to this standard. What are kind of your thoughts from that perspective, Paul?
I don't know. I've been just kind of reading through some of the items here, and I think that some of them can be addressed in the design phase, but of course there always needs to be some kind of testing phase, and making sure that you cover all of these today would be, in my mind, pretty technically challenging. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, no,
like I'd love to see the anyone who's looked at this standard, which is pretty complete, in my opinion, and put that into some kind of actual testing framework and made it work. Like, how much customization do you have to do for each application to do that, and what's the best way to automatically test your applications for many of these conditions? That would be the next step. I'd look to the next step for me. I mean, because we can talk about what the list of things you should look for. I think that the harder part is automating that and customizing that automation for each application.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree in the sense that it's not by no means. I mean, there's 19 sections to the different like sections of verification that you can perform. And each one of those can have multiple subsections tied to it. So to that end, yeah, it's comprehensive. I think that to some degree, though, not all sections are applicable to all applications. So, for example, there's an entire section on mobile, as well as an entire section on cryptography at rest. Depending on what you've built the application to do, some of those things may or may not be applicable. At a high level for our listeners, though, I do want to just kind of go through what those different levels mean from the standards perspective. And then we can actually talk to specifically with what's in the standard itself, the thoughts that they have or the kind of feedback that they have on things like automated testing, penetration testing, architecture and guidance, as well as, of course, building in unit tests or integration tests accordingly. But at a high level, so level one, something that all application software should adhere to. And that is, in this case, an application will achieve level one if it adequately defends against application security vulnerabilities that are easy to discover and included in the OWASP top 10. So to that end, basically, if you need to follow the top 10 standards in some way, which all applications really should, then they've kind of met that level one requirement. You're running a scanner, you're finding the low-hanging fruit, you're more or less compliant, for lack of a better term, to level one. Level two is where it kind of gets interesting, because for level two, if it adequately defends against most of the risks associated with software today, which, by the way, is a lot of risks, anywhere from cloud-based to hard-coded passwords, for example, is going to be hard to comply to. And to the extent that that's important to have from an applications that are containing sensitive data, makes sense. I mean, to the extent that they say threats to level two applications will typically be skilled and motivated attackers, focusing on specific targets using tools and techniques that are highly practiced and effective at discovering and exploiting weaknesses within applications. To me, that says penetration test or bug bounty hunters looking at the application in earnest, because you're going beyond the low level, I can run a scanner and I'm done. You now have to have some domain expertise. And then finally, level three.
It's not just.
Go ahead.
I think we need to separate this from what like a pen test or external scanner would look at. Because if you're developing software in-house, I have access to the systems and all the software and the container environment. I want to embed inside of my process, not an external scan. I think, sure, that's part of it. But to test a lot of these things, I think effectively, use to your advantage your knowledge of the application and build your application such that these things can be easily tested by internal resources. So maybe there's code or some kind of process that's embedded inside your application that serves as a check for a lot of these things. Like I'm looking at like verify that untrusted file data submitted to the application is not used directly with the file IO commands. Like, sure, you could test for that externally, but if there's something in the application that lets you more easily test for that internally, via some piece of code or library or process that's inside your app, I think that's a much better way to roll. I don't know how you feel about that, Keith. I'm kind of looking at it as a parallel between external vulnerability scanning and trusted vulnerability scanning.
Absolutely, absolutely. So to the extent that, for example, for level 3, that they say a secure application is modularized in a meaningful way. So that means that from a design level, you had to have thought about this before you developed the application, right? You can't achieve level 3 in retrospect. So yeah, I mean, to the extent that if you can test things as you're writing them, and in fact, it does talk specifically to the idea of building unit tests and integration tests to perform specific or relevant fuzzing of abuse cases is important to do and should be included in your development practices. So yeah, absolutely. I think that for any development team that's looking at this standard, it gives them an opportunity to take into consideration some of the compliance requirements that come ahead or come through these different sections, and then can build to spec. Basically, if I can make sure that my application is using microservices and it's Dockerized, or it's running with an API on the back end that has a lot of different servers that are talking to each other in a very secure way, well, then I can pretty easily start to meet the requirements or the guidelines that are presented within this standard, which is easier to do from a development perspective at the get-go. You're right. There's no easy way to apply a standard in retrospect to this sort of problem that they're trying to address, which is build it securely from the get-go, but also make sure that you've got all of the tools, techniques, and procedures in place to test it with external testing later, to make sure that you're actually running some of those automated scans in your build process, so you're catching all the low-hanging fruit right away. Yeah, there's definitely a lot here to chew on from the perspective of, well, how do I get level 3 compliance? And quite frankly, you don't always need level 3 compliance, which I like that they talk to that. They talk to the fact that you can have an application that only really needs to meet level 1 requirements, which is basic.
And what I like too in thinking about how I would use this, I think when you develop an application, it's really difficult to consider all of the different conditions that will be thrown at it. And one of the issues I have today is, I want to test my application for these different conditions. Those could be functional, those could be security related, those could be performance related. If the application isn't giving me good feedback about what happened, it's very difficult for me to test. And I think that's the situation that we're in now. And not to, don't downplay external testing, but it should, external testing typically tries to exploit the vulnerability to see if that condition is in fact present. But if we design the application with many of these things in mind, and we have functional testing that matches something like this, we can test for that stuff, and the application can say, oh, I see you're trying to do this or cause this condition. I'm going to throw an error back. Maybe that error doesn't go back to the user, but it's in some internal log that my test suite can then monitor and say, oh, I did trigger that condition and it was caught, and therefore we're likely much safer from some external adversary that's trying to exploit this condition. Now, you still need the external testing to find any of those conditions you might have missed to test the actual exploitation, but that should be much quicker and easier because you're catching a lot of those exceptions within the application. And this standard, I think, provides a really nice guideline to say, what do I need to account for, maybe to write that log internally so that I can test for these things in my process. Is that a valid strategy, or did I just make all that shit up?
No, you're right. I mean, so for example, this past week, Micah Hoffman, who goes by WebBreacher on Twitter, actually gave an issue ticket into the InfoSec Mentors project that I maintain. And he basically said there was the ability to perform user enumeration in the application based on the way it was built. Now, to some extent, I had built it with the purpose of being able to share out your email address publicly if you wanted to. It was like a self-select or opt-in rather than opt-out scenario. But to his point, if you are allowed to register on the page with anything that's not like a Gmail address or maybe a better known email service provider, you could pretty easily scrape the page for all publicly available email addresses from users, which may or may not be their login credential for their username. So I pretty quickly fixed that, but you're right. That's a design level consideration that initially the intention was to allow for users to be able to publicly share their email if they want to for like mentors or mentees that want to reach out to them. To that end, I kind of reconsidered that after he put that forward and decided, you know what, that's not really necessary. And quite frankly, I know that my inbox is always too full. So if there's the ability to share Twitter and GitHub, that's sufficient. And ended up fixing that as a result. So I have to now go back in and close that issue ticket. But to that end, yeah, being able to think about design level flaws that may or may not exist and thinking very specifically about why you're allowing for something to be entered into your code, whether it's a data collection perspective that we'll talk about a little bit later in the news, or even just a feature or functionality that you're putting forward. Not all of those things can be automatically tested, right? User enumeration is one of those things that you might not be able to build an integration or a unit test or even a scanning test for. It's a process and a logic level vulnerability, not a functional or a technical level vulnerability like SQL injection or cross-site scripting. So to that end, I know that we've only covered this at a high level. I imagine we'll be coming back to the ASVS on a couple of different occasions because, again, there's a lot to it, and I want to make sure that we dive into some of the different sections and give our listeners an opportunity to get an understanding of what this really means for them. But Paul, did we want to jump to the learning and tools before we went to our break?
Sure. I was checking out this 3-hour epic music mix. Of course, I can't listen to it because we're on the air right now, but I'm excited.
Yeah. So yeah, I included a couple of music mixes in there. I also wanted to mention, so O'Reilly had 243 free ebooks that they're making available for people to download in EPUB or MOBI or PDF format. Some of which are related to security, some are development related as well. So I picked up a few DevOps books in there. So definitely check that out. It's a link in the wiki. But the other thing that, as you just mentioned, is there's the 3-hour music mix, which is without any sort of vocals or without words, I should say, which is what I like to listen to when I do development. But then my manager, Jason Haddix, actually told me about this game hype music list that Major League Games plays at all of their events. And that's actually out on Spotify. So if you like lyrics, check that one out because it's got some really, really good dubstep in there. I'm a big fan of dubstep, I'm not going to lie. The last one, though, that I wanted to share with our listeners. And Paul, before I do that, what are your thoughts on dubstep? I mean, I like our intro theme. I think Johnny's done an excellent.
It's growing on me. I do have some that I like. It's growing on me.
I'm gonna have to share with you. There's a Street Fighter theme dubstep that I'm gonna have to share with you at some point. That's pretty cool. So anyway, I digress. The last one that I wanted to talk about before we head into our break, though, is a new tool that was just released by the Salesforce Red team at AppSec Cali this past week. And it's a tool that's available in your browser called Repro Now. It's intended to allow researchers to allow some sort of screen recording of their production of a vulnerability. So like if they're trying to prove that something is vulnerable, they can provide a screen recording that shows it. But as you are screen recording, it's capturing all of your requests to the browser, and it's showing all of the body and the headers and all of that information that a team to reproduce the vulnerability would need to actually walk back and step through it. So basically, it gives you a 4-quadrant look at the ability to reproduce a vulnerability, not only from the video side, but then also from the requests that are being made to the browser via the API that they're kind of getting in the middle of, as well as all of the headers and the body of the submissions and things of that nature. So from the perspective of, especially for my end, working on the bug bounty side and working with a team that has to triage and reproduce vulnerabilities, this is a really awesome tool because you can export that file and then have the researcher, or excuse me, the engineers that are trying to reproduce this, just import this back into the browser and watch it and be able to say, yeah, I can see exactly where this vulnerability comes in. It's at this time in the video with the following requests. Pretty cool.
I think it's a really helpful tool for bug bounty hunters.
And to the extent I would say QA teams, right? Like if a QA team has to go in and reproduce a finding for the development team to fix, maybe something is wrong with the UI UX, for example. If I have to go in and show the developer what's wrong, this is a really great tool to do that.
Yeah, no, I like it for QA as well. It's nice.
So yeah, with that, I guess we'll take a break and then we'll come back and cover the news.